If I asked you what movie defined your childhood, what would you say? Up? The Incredibles? Toy Story? You probably know what they have in common. They're all Pixar masterpieces. So today, we're going to take a journey through the history of one of the most important animation studios. Because this is District Flicker, so sit back and relax because the show is about to begin. Let's start by saying that art inspires technology and technology inspires art. Edwin Catmull, a scientist, and John Lasseter, a filmmaker, represent both sides of that coin. Unwittingly, they encapsulated the birth of cinema itself, which took place in the period before the Lumiere brothers. While the idea is that cinema was born thanks to the cinematograph, the history of scientific cinema shows that it happened decades before the French invention. A vast experimental tradition was the real cause of what is now called the seventh art. Experiments by Joseph Plateau, Edward Muybridge, and Etienne Jules Marais, to name but a few, had already provided the first glimpses of moving images. 100 years after this revolution, another one was brewing. Several factors helped bring together the three key pieces of the puzzle that created the company. The first of the three was a scientist obsessed with Disney and Einstein. Unable to animate by drawing, he turned to engineering and designed programs that would eventually become the tools of Pixar's artists. Ed Catmull created the first computer-animated short film in 1973 as part of a thesis project. His remarkable achievement was recognized by Richard Taylor, who used it as part of his film, Beautiful World. After a brief stint at the New York Institute of Technology, Catmull was discovered by George Lucas and hired for his expertise in introducing new technologies to the cinema. He joined Lucasfilm despite the constant refusal to develop programs for three-dimensional animation, as the priorities of the New York Institute of Technology lay elsewhere. Edwin wanted to make the first feature-length animated film entirely on a computer. Working with Lucas, he attempted to take a new approach to the chroma key shooting system. In the process, he accomplished two things. He was part of the team that created the first digital editing system, the editor, and he also helped design the Pixar Animation Studios. It is said that the company's name is a combination of two words, pixel and animator, which were the two suggestions for the name of the new computer, which, by the way, was the most advanced of its time. While Lucas was dazzling his team with his useful discoveries, a young John Lasseter joined the ranks of Disney. Returning from CalArts, a school founded by Walt Disney to train future animators, John and Ed shared an unbridled passion for Disney's creations, which they focused on in different areas. Lasseter was welcomed into Disney's doors with a couple of productions he directed while still in school, The Lady and the Lamp and Nightmare. Both shorts won Academy Awards in the student category, a record that still stands today. His first major project assigned to him was directing Brave Little Toaster, where he aimed to introduce technology that, under his control, faced the challenge of mixing animation with live action. Lasseter wanted to replicate the effect, but this time combining traditional animation with the new technology. The premise of the story would become one of the cornerstones of Toy Story, as the toaster told the story of several objects that search for their owner after being abandoned. He wanted to animate the characters by hand and then combine them with computer-generated environments. But after a meeting in which the filmmaker shared his idea with Disney executives, he was fired because they thought it was too avant-garde. A technological convention brought the scientist and the artist together. Catmull had the advances, but lacked the knowledge to tell a great cinematic story. Lasseter knew how to structure a story, but he didn't have the means to make it happen. The stage was set. In the blink of an eye, Lasseter was hired to work in the division he commanded in the education offices. The first project that posed a challenge to the duo was The Adventures of Andre and Vi, a short film signed by Lucasfilm Computer Graphic Prayer, whose production process was tortuous but yielded a couple of technical discoveries. The first was that to tell the story satisfactorily, they had to create textures that could stretch and move as if they had a spring, something that seemed impossible until then. All the animation was rigid and lacked that natural bounce. And secondly, Catmull discovered that if the animations didn't have some sense of movement, they looked stiff. So he developed software that would add a little blur every time the characters moved. He called this addition motion blur. Due to scheduling problems, they presented the unfinished short film. The team was devastated. They thought the audience would react badly. But in that fateful presentation, Catmull discovered the value of having Lasseter in the company. His concerns were technical and scientific, not narrative. In his own words, "Visual elegance is irrelevant if you're not telling the story the way it should be told." This phrase sums up Pixar's style, which tends toward the screenwriting work that we will analyze in the second video. The success of this first short coincided with the duo's departure from Lucasfilm. George Lucas hired Catmull because he wanted a digital editing program and he wanted to learn the craft. Both goals had been achieved, and Lucas had just divorced, making it impossible for him to continue funding the Pixar division. Despite its value, the house was sold 3 years later, after many offers, to none other than Steve Jobs, who had been ousted from his own company, Apple. Pixar's first year as a separate entity from George Lucas saw the creation of Luxo Jr., an Oscar-nominated short film that became the studio's emblem. Jobs lost capital, but he saw potential. His patience as an investor would pay off immediately when they won the Oscar for Best Animated Short Film for Tin Toy. And though it was beginning to gain artistic recognition, the financial situation said otherwise. A crisis loomed, but Jobs persevered, despite losing millions of dollars. According to Carbo, Pixar couldn't have survived without Steve. He could be brilliant and inspiring, but he could also be impossible, threatening, even bullying. His contribution to the company is immeasurable. The three geniuses came together: finance, technology, and art. These three elements, along with a series of short films and TV commercials, opened the doors to Disney, the giant that was about to embark on a series of highly successful films. They made a deal with the small but promising company, financed 3 films in exchange for distribution and ownership. In addition, the Mouse House demanded something else: access to technical advances, which they quickly made their own. One of them stood out: the CAPS program, a digital ink and paint system applied to 2D, which was implemented and recognized in Beauty and the Beast. Also developed was Grinderman, a live-action special effects program that won Catmull an Academy Award for its creation and was used in none other than Jurassic Park. While Disney benefited from the programs created by the studio, Lasseter struggled to shape a script about toys coming to life. Early versions were significantly altered by the Mouse Company's executives, resulting in an unfriendly movie that was immediately rejected by the executives who had altered it. In an event known as Black Friday, production on Toy Story was shut down completely. Lasseter and his team made a decision that would change Pixar forever. They decided to ignore Disney's suggestions and instead write the movie they wanted to see. They followed their instincts, ignored the animation giant, and presented a script whose main characteristic was to differentiate itself from the studio they had allied with. The result is well known: a resounding success, not only financially, but also technically and artistically. Praised by the critics, the movie taught its creators 2 things. The story is important, therefore you must act and think accordingly. That is, always think about the structure of the plot. And the second is to trust the process, but assume that it's not going to fix things. Making a movie is an act of faith. 2 other processes were part of the creation and consolidation of the studio, which took advantage of a period of stagnation and decline at Disney. In an effort to make money, they decided to produce sequels exclusively for the video format. Productions like The Little Mermaid 2 and The Lion King 2 are examples of the lack of ideas within the company. By the way, it almost affected Pixar, as the executive's directive was to make the sequel to Toy Story as a product destined for the small screen. Before delving into this battle, it is worth mentioning the contribution of Box Live. It wasn't just a test and a refutation that Toy Story wasn't a fluke. Creating a story based on an anthill was a challenge. The number of characters to animate at that time was complex enough. In this second movie, the challenge was to animate hundreds of them. The software was barely good enough to put 50 characters on the screen. Lasseter wanted hundreds. In a hurry, they developed a program that could handle a maximum of 437 characters on the screen. You can imagine the contribution Pixar made with that small contribution. Imagine what sagas like The Lord of the Rings would have been without this technological advance. Toy Story 2 was a disaster. With the crew on vacation and Disney interfering once again, the results couldn't have been better. Pixar didn't have confidence in the direct-to-home format, and the directors in charge of the project weren't hitting the mark. After a first cut, they decided to rebuild the movie from scratch. Once again, John led the charge. It took a weekend to rewrite the script and get production moving. Against all odds, they managed to meet the release date and make another hit, as well as one of the best sequels in movie history. This swampy process taught the studio the value of self-criticism and the need to rethink processes. It also represented a temporary break with Disney, allowing them to renegotiate an agreement that culminated in a mutually beneficial feature. In 2006, Jobs sold Pixar to Disney on the condition that they would not influence award decisions and would operate independently. Catmull took over as president, and Lasseter stayed on as creative director. The deck was stacked in favor of Pixar, which was on the rise, while Disney was in a major crisis. The key to Disney's recovery was Ed Catmull's implementation of what he called the Pixar culture, which essentially meant using the same mechanisms that had made his studio successful. So much so that they influenced films like Meet the Robinsons and Bolt, which were rewritten and redesigned from scratch, and received Oscar nominations, thanks to the constant input of Pixar animators. They also helped revitalize 2D animation in films like The Princess and the Frog, which, although a box office failure, defined the artistic and commercial direction of the new Disney, moving away from sequels and rehashes and culminating with Tangled, which became the second highest grossing film after a 16-year box office drought. Catmull and Lasseter went from being Disney fans to restoring dignity to the studio that had captivated them as children with its remarkable creations. For decades, they had been chasing a dream that would lead them to the company they longed to work for. There are many more stories to discover, and if you're interested, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so we can see each other in the next video.